now we're going to have a joint presentation between Steph and Jess. So I'll hand over to you two women.
I'm very proud to share this presentation time with Steph. I really believe that her work in this area is extremely important, not only for like right now, but in the long term as well, as we clean up the mess after everything's said and done. Policies which allow men to be housed as and with women in prison based on sex self-identification exist in every state except the Northern Territory, to my knowledge. And they're pictured on the screen so that you can find the one from your state and be able to recognize it when you see it. I could not find any provisions within the Northern Territory Corrections Management Act. And just some backstory on this, in January 2015, the executive director of the Darwin Community Legal Service, Caitlin Perry, made submissions to the Australian Human Rights Commission stating that legislation governing the Northern Territory Department of Correctional Services is silent with respect to management of transgender inmates. Further, there is no policy addressing this issue. The department has advised that current practice is to classify transgender inmates according to sex at birth rather than gender identity, unless medical evidence is provided indicating that this is not appropriate. So if there is not yet similar policy in the Northern Territory, like the other states, there may be in the not too distant future. Regarding South Australia, officials have stated previously that a policy regarding the placement of gender diverse prisoners has been in use since 2014. However, it's apparently not publicly available. The South Australian Correctional Services Act is publicly available, of course, and it does include provisions regarding placing men in women's prisons. It states that facilities and programs developed for the imprisonment of prisoners should be individually designed as much as reasonably practical to take account of the prisoner's gender identity or sexual identity. And there are familiar provisions regarding searches and transfers of prisoners to other prisons. As we know, these policies allow men to be housed with women in women's prisons and require that the men have their pronouns respected, amongst many other provisions and privileges. I want to focus on a particular part of these policies, one which state and federal government officials like to throw around to justify the policy's existence and to justify placing men with imprisoned women. I am, of course, referring to risk assessment processes. The risk assessment processes within each state's policy or legislation are similar and include the obligation for correction staff to consider particular criteria of the person making the transfer request. These considerations include the prisoner's criminal history and the nature of their current offense, along with custodial history, which is whether or not they've caused trouble or hurt anyone while incarcerated in the past. However, we know that the risk assessment processes are either not being followed or the processes are not efficient at keeping women prisoners safe. Mark Butler from the Herald Sun recently interviewed me, and we discussed the current situation at Dame Phyllis Frost Center, where imprisoned women are having to petition the government and prison staff regarding their own safety. A dangerous male offender, a man that has been convicted of sexually assaulting a child and a woman, was placed with these vulnerable women. So I asked, how did that decision make it through a risk assessment process? It's honestly difficult to understand how any of these policies made it through a risk assessment process in the first place. Housing men with women in prison introduces new risks to an already vulnerable population instead of only reducing the risk to the vulnerable male offender. At-risk male prisoners must be housed and protected within male prisons. It's really simple. As stated via the single-sex prisons' recent media statement, letters, and submissions, been harping on about this, these policies are in breach of international standards as well as our state and national legislation. For example, Rule 11 from the Nelson Mandela Rules, which discusses the different categories of prisoners and their separation, and it is based on sex. While points A, B, and C may all be breached in many or some circumstances, point A of Rule 11 is absolutely being breached by policies which allow the consideration of cross-sex placement. It states, men and women shall so far as possible be detained in separate institutions. In an institution which receives both men and women, the whole of the premises allocated to women shall be entirely separate. Men do not belong in women's prisons, and this is clear both legally and morally. We must remember that very, very vulnerable and traumatized women are at the heart of this issue. They're not political pawns, and they're not hardened criminals or monsters. Some of the characteristics of women prisoners: they present with concerning rates of traumatic brain injury. This can be from repeated suffocation or serious head injuries, being punched, etc. They are frequently victims of physical abuse and sexual assault. Imprisoned women have high rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and other mental illnesses, and they experience poverty at high rates. Research indicates that imprisoned women have a much higher need for mental health support than men do when entering prison. And women make more self-harm attempts while they are in prison. Women are incarcerated by and large for minor offenses and petty crime. Women are not as violent as men while incarcerated, and women are incarcerated predominantly in low security prisons. Many incarcerated women are mothers. We know from experience and evidence that men directly and indirectly cause most, if not all, of the conditions, injuries, and mental health issues that women prisoners present with. We also know that men are more violent and commit more crime and more serious crimes. As Steph's data shows, male pattern criminality persists despite identifying as a woman. I'm going to hand it over to Steph now, and then I will come back in a little bit.
To start, I'd just like to provide a little bit of background around the reasoning behind my efforts in this space. I have an abiding interest in trauma and trauma-informed practice, as well as male violence against women. I've had this interest for quite some time and have tried to supplement what I know and my knowledge through postgrad studies. One of the things that I observed early on was behaviours exhibited by some male trans activists felt like they mirrored a lot of what we see in the Duluth power and control wheel. I primarily saw the behaviour as examples of those described, like in this graphic from The Line, where objectification of women and rigid stereotypes and beliefs around what women and men can or should be allowed to do forms the basis of male violence against women. From there, it didn't take me long to think, well, if a person is going to base their identity upon rigid stereotypes, then this could actually be quite a large problem. Our Watch released, who's a national charity that looks at male violence against women, they recently released a practice guide called Men in Focus. And they document 4 drivers of male violence against women. They are condoning violence against women, men's control of decision-making, and limits to women's independence and in public and private life, rigid gender stereotyping and dominant forms of masculinity, male peer relations, and cultures of masculinity that emphasize aggression, dominance, and control. Now, I submit that the failure of organisations such as Stonewall and ACON to explicitly condemn harassment, threats of violence, as well as actual violence perpetrated by males in the service of transgender rights could be seen as condoning male violence against women. Secondly, it is no news to anyone that our main decision makers remain predominantly male, and that they would not and do not have the same understanding and awareness of what the impact of loss of single-sex spaces, such as in prisons, will have upon women. This, in combination with well-supported evidence that says that women are often disbelieved when we raise concerns about male behaviour and male pattern violence, it sets a very grim scene. In relation to the third point, would males who are effeminate be so easily supported and relegated or pushed into the woman category if men weren't deeply attached to their idea of what an ideal man is? I submit that they would not. One of the first documents, given my awareness of male violence, one of the things I thought about was, well, are men who identify as transgender, are they more likely to exhibit behaviours that are more in line with females in terms of criminality? And one of the first documents most people might come across, as I did, is this study by Dehaena from Dehaena and others from 2011, which examines the outcomes for individuals who've had surgical interventions related to gender for the years 1973 to 2003. The study found that male participants had similar risk for criminal convictions as male controls, and therefore an elevated risk for for criminal convictions as opposed to female controls. Well, some have sought to suggest that's not the outcome of the study. As you can see here, that was identified in the text. In 2019, I started trying to gather data from Queensland Corrective Services, which I'll, if I can remember, we'll call QCS from here on in. I tried to gather data from them regarding this matter and identify if the trends I was aware of from overseas, such as that from Fair Play for women in the UK, were replicated here, and what Corrective Services and the Minister, Honourable Mark Ryan, were doing in relation to this matter. The first thing able to be identified from the data, and you can see it on the slide there, the individuals housed in QCS accommodations on the 30th of June of each year, males far exceeded females in the prison estate to the tune of about 90 to 10%. Disaggregating the data further to take self-declared gender identity into account, that same pattern remains evident. That is to say, those individuals incarcerated in Queensland QCS accommodations on 30th of June, males were far greater in number than females who identified as transgender. Now, to be clear, when individuals self-identify, they are placed in the accommodation for their sex, but they can, as shown by Jess, there is policy in place that they can apply to be housed in the opposite sex estate. Although the numbers are small, the disparity, I believe, is stark and replicates what we know about overall male versus female offending. The number of males who identify as transgender in QCS accommodations range from 16 in 2014 to as high as 31 in 2017. In no year in the relevant years were females who identify as transgender greater than 1. It must be noted, though, as far as I've been able to clarify so far, it appears that individuals who have had surgical intervention related to gender and had their birth certificates altered in line with the current births, deaths and marriages legislation, those individuals appear to be placed in the female estate if they are male and have had that surgery. At this time, though, it appears there's no ability to track those individuals. To my mind, this is a significant data corruption issue, and a dereliction of duty in relation to our UN commitments as outlined by Jess in relation to the Mandela rules, just in relation also to ensuring that we're accurately recording and reporting on male violence. So why do small numbers of males in the female prison estate matter? Well, as Jess outlined, this is where considerations regarding the negative impact of even one male might have on multiple women in the female prison estate. It matters not only because the information suggests that the rate of male offending appears to persist despite gender identity, there's also the matter of male pattern offending. That is, what types of crimes are being committed by males. As noted by Jess, males and females are different in their behaviours and criminal profile, and the commission of violent and sexual offences are predominantly undertaken by males. This is also an enduring pattern across time and across place. So that's an internationally recognised and well-documented pattern. To discuss this further, we're going to look at two specific crimes, namely murder and aggravated sexual assault. So in relation to murder, this is individuals charged or convicted of the offence of murder as their most serious offence. So you can see again that males predominantly are the predominant perpetrators being charged or convicted for that crime, and females are quite a deal less than that. You will note also that in each year, there were 3 males who self-identified as transgender being held in QCS accommodations, charged or convicted for murder. If self-ID were in place in the years 2013 to 2017, that would increase the number of recorded female murders by 10 or more %. And by increase, I mean artificially increase, because those individuals are male. If self-ID were in place, that could mean that the government could be threatened with legal action lest they transfer those individuals to the female prison estate. As we do not know who those individuals are, it's difficult to assess how great a specific risk they might pose. But what we do know, what we can see, is that even from these small numbers, it doesn't appear that the criminal profile of males who self-identify as transgender is similar to the female prison population. As such, I submit that the data that we have, people need to pull back from going gung-ho in terms of self-ID and placing males in the female prison estate, while this information is gathered properly for all jurisdictions in Australia, as well as internationally. Perhaps it's more relevant that this data is recorded as a subset of male crime rather than female crime, because it certainly does not appear to be fitting with what is occurring in the female data for Queensland. This same disparity and difference between males who say they're transgender and the data related to female crime is evident when we look at aggravated sexual assault as the most serious offence. So in terms of sexual crime, those convicted or charged of aggravated sexual assault in the relevant years are presented here. And you can see again that once again, males are the predominant perpetrators charged or convicted of that offence. When we disaggregate it and look at the self-ID population as opposed to the female population, you can see that the female offending, while it was less than the male offending in the general population data, it was almost equal certainly in 2017, and almost 50% matched by males who identify as transgender. So that suggests once again that the criminal profile of these individuals is not best placed within the female data, but in fact more relevant as being compared to male data. When we look and consider that these figures for the female offending relates to 50 or so % of the Queensland population and is almost matched by perhaps 1% of the population that males that self-identify as transgender, you can see that there are questions to be asked about how we are recording this information and the decisions being made. What self-ID means for women in prison is not only would the prison estate become mixed sex, resulting in some women feeling scared or actively re-traumatized by the mere presence of males, it also means that the risk and likelihood of violent and sexual offences could be vastly increased, something that everyone, I think, has an interest in ensuring doesn't occur. Certainly, if our stated commitment to the UN instruments is anything to go by, Australia has an interest in ensuring that vulnerable female prisoners are not exposed to increased risk. I'd submit that unless and until there's evidence to suggest otherwise, we must prioritise the safety and well-being of incarcerated women over the interests of those who seek to live as women, particularly in the context of single-sex spaces such as prisons. It's important because of what we know about male pattern offending and because we know that Australia's First Nation women continue to be overrepresented in the prison population in Australia. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and all incarcerated women are recognised, as Jess noted, as being very likely to have trauma histories related to male violence. I simply do not believe it is fair to expose those women to the possibility of further re-traumatisation. And as a final sub-note, I just wanted to add that in May, I submitted a new right to information request to update this data so that we could get 2020 and 2021. And I was told that despite the previous requests being being progressed on the standard rate, that this time it would cost hundreds of dollars. And since that time, I have asked for a review and followed up by phone and email requesting a meeting with the minister and, asking, is this something that could be reconsidered? And I'm yet to hear back. So I am quite worried that, there is some serious worries here and that there may be some worries about actually getting the data to move forward.
So what can we do to fight against these policies? You can continue to support efforts or jump in for the first time by supporting the groups working in this area. Single-sex prisons, International Network for Incarcerated Girls and Women, Fair Go for Queensland Women. I think we're all aware of Keep Prisons Single-Sex in the UK and the US. And please also check out Sisters Inside Inc. They do amazing and very important work. 2, lobbying your member for Parliament and other state and federal ministers with relevant portfolios. Send emails, letters, call them, and if you're comfortable, try to make an appointment to go talk to them. We hear all that all the time, that that's the action to take, and there's a reason for that, because it works. It can work. It might take a while, but it works. Share social media posts and past speeches and presentations, articles, blogs, etc. from our groups. Both Steph and I have spoken about this a lot and about our individual campaigns and efforts. Please contact Mark McGowan in relation to planned changes to the WA Equal Opportunity Act. They have not been implemented yet, per my knowledge, but some of the planned changes are regarding transgender, diverse, and non-binary persons. And these provisions absolutely place women at risk. It's basically bringing in self-ID to WA formally. Single Sex Prisons WA did release a media statement about these planned changes and our concerns. So you're absolutely more than welcome to share that. There's also a post on the WDI WA Facebook page, which has details on contacting Mark McGowan. And I will share some links in the chat afterward as well, so women can find all of this stuff that we've been mentioning. Please also contact Daniel Andrews and other relevant Victorian ministers and demand that policies which allow cross-sex placement be repealed, and demand that all biological male prisoners be transferred out of women's prisons as a matter of urgency. Please send freedom of information or right to information requests to your state's corrections department or corrective services department. Steph has outlined the information and how to ask for it. So I will also share that as well, because getting consistent data is really, really important for what she's doing. Generally speaking, to support women in prison, you can contact prisons and post-release centers in your area and ask what items can be donated to the women and how best to do that. Sometimes they will take suits and other clothing for the women for their court appearances, and they might take books and magazines and other things like that, particularly around the holidays. Finally, please talk to your friends and family about the women in prison and how vulnerable they are. It doesn't have to be framed, in a gender critical argument, because this is much, much bigger than these policies. Discuss the radical idea that women may not even belong in prison in the first place, and they certainly shouldn't have men placed with them. We really need to continue building momentum and be steadfast in our fight against these policies. We know women have already been harmed and traumatized by the placement of men in their prisons, and we have to fight back against the madness. No men in women's prisons. That's it.